Welcome to SiGMA TV and to the SEO Affiliate Grand Slam. I'm extremely excited to be joined today by Will Frogley from Blueclaw, and we're going to be talking about don't drop the ball on JavaScript rendering. Will, thank you for joining us. How are you today?
Hi, good, thank you. How are you?
I'm brilliant, and I'm very, very excited to be hearing about what you have to say. I'm not going to hang around. I'm going to hand over to you and come back in just a minute. How does that sound?
Sure, I'll kick off then.
Fire away.
Today we're going to be talking about JavaScript rendering, which is not always the most exciting conversation, but definitely something that needs to be had and is going to become more and more important in the world of SEO. It's particularly relevant to the iGaming community, which is why we're kind of talking about it today. But also, you know, the way that Google is pushing forward in terms of their strategy, it's going to become more and more important into the future, and particularly in May next year. So that's why we've put it on the agenda today. And we just kind of want to cover some of the main points on how it functions on one of our websites, the impact that might have, and how we can come up with some solutions to better handle JavaScript rendering for both the user and from an SEO perspective. So I'll start off by explaining what client-side rendering is. And there are two main forms of JavaScript rendering. The first is client-side rendering, which basically puts the resource onto the user. So it means that when a user or a search engine that's crawling the site requests access, we basically send over a package of JavaScript and the initial HTML. Now, this is unrendered and puts the resource onto the user's end. That means that we can be having a negative impact on user experience, on page speed, and also that Google will be seeing that, and it therefore has a negative impact on our SEO rankings and the ranking factors and signals that we're looking for to send in a positive way towards Google for us to get our performance up. This is particularly important for iGaming sites because a lot of the solutions that we see for front end on iGaming websites are built almost completely in JavaScript often. Now, whilst only 2% of users may have JavaScript disabled, the main issue that comes here is when Googlebot is crawling the site. Why is this important to us? Google crawls our site in waves. The first time it crawls, it has JavaScript disabled, and it's effectively looking at a text-only version of the site. Now, this means that all of the content that we have within JavaScript isn't getting picked up on that first crawl. And it's particularly important for us to get the real key elements of the site, such as the navigation, anything that's really heavily keyword optimized, into that first wave. That's going to allow us to get a lot more relevance from Google's perspective, but also allows us to remain competitive. And this is one of the key areas that, you know, for us to look at. It's a priority, because if we're not being competitive in this area, we're really opening ourselves up to risk for competitors to come in, have far better solutions in terms of the JavaScript rendering, not completely client side, but on the server side, and they'll be rewarded accordingly, which of course means that we're losing out. So when Googlebot hits our site, it will hit this text-only version. It will then later come back, and a quite resource-intensive version of a crawl will happen, where it renders in the JavaScript as a user might through their browser. Now, this puts a lot of resource requirement onto Google, which means that they won't particularly go deep with this crawl. And if we have a lot of pages on our site, there's a really kind of high risk that Google will miss out on that content that's really valuable, but perhaps buried a bit deeper within the site. If we can optimize this to our advantage, it means that the opportunity that competitors are currently leveraging in their favor, we have the opportunity to take that away from them and get better visibility and better performance from search engine traffic onto our site. The more content that we have available pre-rendered when it arrives at either the Googlebot or the user, means that they're going to have more value associated with that, and we get rewarded accordingly. Like I said, if that isn't being easily accessible, then we could, to a certain extent, be wasting our time by creating that content. Particularly for iGaming, where we have time-sensitive elements such as events or leagues, we really need Google to be able to access that content in a fast and timely manner. Now, if we're relying on them to have that resource available, that second wave may not come for quite a while. And we miss the opportunity to get visibility for some of those key areas that are going to drive value and eventually revenue for us. So this is particularly important for us because in May 2020, Google has pre-announced an experience algorithm update. Now, this means that they're going to be looking far more in depth at the user experience journey that someone might hit when they gain access to our site, and how good that is in terms of quality. This is becoming increasingly important in a mobile-first world because Google wants to be providing their users with a really elegant experience, and they associate some of that kind of quality with the Google brand as a user. So it's really important for their strategy to be giving rewarding sites to a user that's gratifying, particularly if it's a fundamentally kind of focused around lead generation or a more kind of financially focused site where we're looking at gaining revenue from the user. If we're not doing a PPC spend and we're trying to get organic visibility, Google needs to make sure that they're rewarding their user accordingly. Otherwise, they're not really getting anything out of the relationship with us. Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, the algorithm update that they've pre-announced for May 2021, the experience update, this is unusual for Google to pre-announce it. It generally means that it's going to have a really, really substantial impact on search landscapes, and that we are basically getting told by Google that we need to prepare for it. That's why now is the perfect time to be looking at some of the JavaScript issues we may be having on our site, making sure that we've got the most elegant solution, but also using May 2021 as the opportunity that it is to shake things up a little bit. Quite often we find sites have a longevity when they get to the higher positions on results pages. And this is really an opportunity for us to shake that up a little bit by making sure that we've fully optimized our site from a JavaScript perspective. So how do we do that? There are a couple of solutions. Some are better than others, and some have more risk than others. But again, some have more cost, as always. The first solution is server-side rendering. This is where, instead of sending over an initial HTML and JavaScript package and putting the resource onto the user or the crawler, we basically pre-render this. We send it as a package over to the user and the crawler, and that means that we've taken that resource away from them. We then have to put that resource onto our server. So it can mean that we've got a bit more in terms of cost, that we need a bit more in terms of kind of infrastructure. And it also depends at what scale is our site being accessed, how frequently, what kind of traffic are we getting. But this does mean that when the user or the crawler has this first crawl with JavaScript disabled, they're seeing a full version of the site. They're seeing all of that content that's really, really rich. And they're also seeing everything that we want them in terms of keywords, in terms of the events, and all the stuff that we talked about, like leagues, in a timely manner. Now that reduces a lot of the risk associated with having client-side rendering and means that we've got a much greater opportunity to be competitive in an organic space. The second solution is dynamic rendering. Now, this is a pretty elegant solution, but there are some difficulties and some potential risks associated with it. Now, dynamic rendering is actually dynamic server-side rendering. It's what we were talking about with server-side rendering, but it's where we have it set up so that a crawler will see a server-side rendered site, but a user will see a client-side rendered site. Now, this does mean that we still carry the risks of if the user, bearing in mind that only around 2% of users have JavaScript disabled, that they might hit a blank site and it won't render out fully. The main thing that carries as a risk here is that Google might realize that we're doing this, and sometimes that can come with a penalization. However, this tends to be quite rare. What we're doing with dynamic server-side rendering is we're packaging it up in the same way that initial HTML and JavaScript goes over to the user. But if it's a crawler, which we identified by reading their user agent, then we do the server-side rendering where we package it up and give them that full version of the site. This means that Google or any other search engines are still able to access all of that quality, that equity, the keyword optimization, and the timely elements. And that kind of impacts our organic visibility. However, it does mean that some of the page speed issues that we might have might still affect the user when they're accessing the site. And if we can come up with a balance, sometimes what we can do is pick out key areas of the site. So the main navigation, some of the about us information, some of the keyword optimization, and pick that to be in the initial HTML. This means that we're really serving some of that key stuff, and that when the user hits the site, we're reducing the opportunity for them to bounce off the page, because they'll at least be engaged with something whilst we're waiting for the JavaScript to pass and load in. As mentioned previously, this is going to be increasingly important as of next year and moving into the future. The world's becoming increasingly mobile first, and we're really looking at the user experience as a much bigger factor when we're being rewarded with organic visibility by search engines, but particularly Google. A lot of the updates that Google has run with in the previous year, but also the updates that they've pre-announced, such as the experience update, will really look at these core vitals around page speed, around usability, around whether the site's completely in JavaScript. And they're also being a bit stricter with their own resources. So for us to optimize for these solutions, ensures some sort of kind of stability and longevity moving into next year, but also makes it the most of the opportunities to be competitive. That's going to be one of the key things, particularly for iGaming sites, as we mentioned, because they're so highly focused often on JavaScript solutions, and is really, really kind of key thing for us to be including into our strategies next year. There are a couple of solutions that you can access online around dynamic server-side rendering. Often the infrastructure changes that you need for server-side rendering will become a dev project on their own, or it's a conversation you can have with your agency about how they can help with that. But the main thing is you start doing something about it. Thanks.
Will, I've got to say that I've been listening to you. It has been amazing. Just absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?
Sure, go ahead.
So first of all, when you're talking about this and you were talking about our expectations and mobile first, I suddenly was transported back, I don't know, maybe I'm showing my age, but maybe 36 years to when we first came along with cassettes that you'd load up onto your BBC computer, and there you'd have Chucky Egg, and you'd see a thing going along, and it could take 20 minutes for that game to load up. We are so far away from this, obviously, and we as users are so expectant of good quality content at lightning speed. What happens to a site when May 21st comes along? What happens to a site who hasn't managed to get themselves ready for it? What's the result going to be for them?
So there's two elements to that answer. The first is from the organic perspective that we're talking about in terms of us getting visibility when you're doing a search. Because Google has picked up on that importance and what you've talked about there in terms of the expectation from a user, they're really going to start reflecting that in the way they return results. And the results that you'll be seeing in positions 1, 2, 3, even the full first page, will be the ones that have the faster, the more kind of user-friendly sites. So it's going to affect the way that we search, the sites that come up. And also when we've got older sites, they tend to start to get a bit slower over time. So it drives innovation, and it makes sure that when Google's providing their user with a website, they're getting the best kind of service. Because Google really, in terms of its business model, doesn't always get a lot out of us if it's giving us organic visibility. With pay-per-click, there's a really clear kind of return on investment for Google. Mm-hmm. Whereas if it's organic, we need to be making sure that we're driving value for them. And we do that through providing, quality sites that are, like I said, user-friendly. That other side of the user-friendliness is when somebody does click onto our site, regardless of what visibility we've got, they could potentially bounce off. If they hit a site and nothing loads, if it's too slow, if they don't see what they're expecting, it's really easy for them to just bounce off, and then we lose that user completely. And that's what like you've mentioned, that expectation now is really, really high, and we need to make sure that we're living up to that. Otherwise, we're losing out on users.
We don't have patience anymore. We as users really don't have patience anymore. I can remember just a couple of days ago, I went to a site. It took more than 5 seconds to load. I was gone. and that's how it is. And now that we're sort of disseminating it and talking about it right now, well, you know, it kind of is bringing it home. Now, of course, Google is a household name, and whilst there are competitors to Google, you know, that it's such a household name that if somebody said, oh, you know, where is this place, I'd say, hey, Google it. You know, it really is. How you mentioned when you were talking in that presentation, and thank you so much for it, but you mentioned that it's unusual for Google to announce an upgrade such as the one that is coming in May 21. When did it announce this?
So it was actually a couple of weeks ago. So that would be October time, late October, maybe early November. Which is a lot of warning for Google. Normally it's a couple of days afterwards. They're like, oh, hey, we made this change.
Yeah,
and
this is more than 6 months in advance.
Yeah, so that really kind of lends itself to explain why it's so important. It's also, you know, important for them, like I mentioned, to drive innovation, and it keeps things moving forward, which, you know, is testament to Google's kind of impact on the internet as a whole. The other thing is there with other search engines that they tend to follow suit from Google. So if Google's doing these kind of rollouts, we can assume that other search engines are following suit. And that's why we tend to optimize for Google first. And like I said, mobile first, as more and more users become accessing sites through mobile rather than desktop.
Well, listen, Will, if anybody's watching this and they're suddenly panicking because they know that this big change is coming, how can someone get hold of you guys? And I'm assuming that you will be very happy to help.
Absolutely. We're always happy to help with questions, and it's quite technical, so I appreciate that there might be some follow-up from this. You can reach me on my email. It's william.frogley@blueclaw.co.uk.
Brilliant. Will, thank you so much for joining us here on the SEO Affiliate Grand Slam. I'm fairly sure that we're going to be talking to you again, and I'm very excited about seeing what's going to happen in May 21. So Will from Blueclaw, thank you very much indeed.